Welcome to another deep dive. We got a really fascinating set of sources from you this time.
Yeah, this one's a big one. It's basically the entire history of humanity.
And then some. I mean, we're talking from the very beginning of, like, the universe all the way to the potential for, I don't even know, like, some pretty radical changes to what it even means to be human in the future.
Absolutely. And we've got some really uh, dense material to get through, some serious academic stuff here. But our mission, I think, is to really highlight those key moments, those turning points where things could have gone one way or another,
Yeah.
and try to figure out how we got to where we are today. Like what were the unexpected consequences of certain events?
Exactly. I mean, we're talking big questions here. Like, for example, for millions of years, there wasn't just one human species, there were several.
Right.
So why is it that Homo sapiens ended up being the only one left?
Yeah. And then what about the agricultural revolution? I mean, that seems like a good thing on the surface, but was it really? Where were the hidden costs, maybe?
Yeah.
And then looking ahead, are we on the brink of another massive change in what it means to be human?
Okay, so to kick things off, let's go back, way back to the very beginning.
Right. So picture this. About 13.5 billion years ago, that's when matter and energy first appear, leading to physics. And then from there, you get atoms, molecules, chemistry. And eventually, much, much later, life itself emerges. And then finally, we get the different species of, the genus Homo, our ancestors.
And this is important, it wasn't like a straight line from one species to the next, right? Like it wasn't just, oh, Ergaster, then Erectus, and then Neanderthals, and then boom, us.
Right, it's much messier than that.
Way messier. Like for a huge chunk of time, we're talking like 2 million years ago to just 10,000 years ago, there were several human species all living together
Right.
at the same time.
It's kind of like, how you have different species of foxes today, or bears, or pigs, all living in the same areas. So for most of human history, it wasn't unusual to have different types of humans coexisting. It's actually kind of weird that we're the only ones left now. It makes you wonder if, like one of the sources puts it, sapiens have good reasons to repress the memory of our siblings.
It really does. Now, one thing all these human species had in common was that their brains were, well, huge
Hugely large, yeah.
compared to other animals. Like a normal mammal, say 60 kilograms, has a brain around 200 cubic centimeters. But early humans, even 2.5 million years ago, they were already at 600. And modern sapiens, we're talking 1,200 to 1,400. Neanderthals, even bigger. So the
Wow.
question is, why this sudden jump in brain power? Why only Homo? It's not like squirrels are building spaceships.
And what's even more interesting is that having a big brain isn't always an automatic win in terms of survival. For 2 million years, despite their big brains and, developing simple tools, our ancestors were still pretty vulnerable. Easy prey for predators, mostly just scraping by, gathering plants, scavenging leftovers. The sources even call them weak and marginal creatures.
So what changed? What gave them the edge? One theory that's pretty convincing is, believe it or not, cooking.
Ah, yeah.
Because when you cook, you can suddenly eat a lot more types of food. You don't have to spend all day chewing. And it means you can have smaller teeth, a smaller digestive system.
And that's huge energy-wise. Both the brain and the digestive system, they use up a lot of energy. So by having shorter intestines, those calories could be redirected to the brain, and boom, bigger brains. It might explain why Neanderthals and sapiens had such a cognitive advantage.
But even with fire, which they had under control by like 150,000 years ago, humans were still a pretty minor presence on the planet, very small population. Around this time, Homo sapiens appears in East Africa, looking very similar to us today. But what happened to all the other human species? Why did they disappear?
Right, and there are a couple of big theories about that. One is the interbreeding theory. It suggests that as sapiens spread out, they encountered other human species like the Neanderthals, and they had kids together. And over time, these populations merged. So if this is true, then a lot of people today, they're not purely sapiens. They've got DNA from these other hominin species.
So depending on which theory is right, you might have a little bit of Neanderthal in you, or even Homo erectus. Now the other theory, it's called the replacement theory, and it paints a very different picture. It says that sapiens and other human species, they just couldn't get along. They were too different. Maybe their anatomy, maybe their mating habits, even their smell. So they didn't interbreed successfully. Instead, sapiens just replaced them, outcompeted them. And in this view, every human alive today can trace their ancestry straight back to those East African sapiens from about 70,000 years ago, all pure sapiens, so to speak.
And what's interesting is that initially, sapiens actually failed. When they first tried to move into the Levant around 100,000 years ago, they ran into Neanderthals and couldn't get a foothold. They eventually retreated back to Africa,
Yeah.
which suggests that even though they look like us, their cognitive abilities might not have been quite there yet. Maybe their communication, their ability to learn, wasn't as developed as it would later become.
But then, around 70,000 years ago, something big happened. It's called the Great Leap Forward. Sapiens launched a second wave out of Africa, and this time, they were unstoppable. Within a few thousand years, they'd spread across Europe and Asia, even crossed the sea to Australia by about 45,000 years ago, and wherever they went, the other human species vanished.
Right, and this period coincides with some incredible innovation. They start inventing things like boats, oil lamps, bows and arrows, needles for sewing clothes, which is crucial if you're moving into colder climates.
Yeah.
And this is also when we see the first clear evidence of art, religion, trade, social hierarchies.
And one of the most fascinating arguments in your sources is that the key to this success wasn't just tools or brains, it was fiction.
Fiction.
Yeah. Imagined realities, myths, things that allowed them to cooperate on a massive scale, even with people they'd never met before. See, small groups, up to maybe 150 people, they can function based on personal relationships. You know everyone. But to build anything bigger, a city, an empire, you need something more, something to bind people together.
I see what you mean. Like, take Peugeot SA. It's not a real thing, in a way. It's a legal fiction. But it has incredible power. It can own property, pay taxes, be sued, all separate from the actual cars or the people who work there.
Right. And the sources are clear that this isn't just a lie. A lie is when you deliberately misrepresent reality. But in imagined reality, it's a shared belief that allows for these complex structures to exist.
So sapiens started to live in this dual reality, the objective world, with trees and rivers and lions, and then this imagined world with gods and nations and corporations. And that imagined world became increasingly powerful.
And the thing about these imagined realities is that they can change really fast. They allow for rapid cultural evolution,
Yep.
much faster than the slow process of genetic evolution, like the French Revolution. Overnight, you go from the divine right of kings to the sovereignty of the people. Chimps, they can't just decide to become bonobos. They need a genetic mutation for that.
That's a good point. So it seems like this flexibility, this ability to adapt their beliefs and behaviors quickly, that's what gave sapiens the edge over other human species, like the Neanderthals. It wasn't necessarily brute force, but this cognitive agility.
Okay, so now we get to life before agriculture, and there's still a lot we don't know. Like, what were their social lives really like? Were they monogamous? What kind of rituals did they have? Did they fight wars?
Right. There's one theory, it's called the ancient commune theory, that suggests they might have had more fluid relationships, maybe shared paternity. Some people even think this could explain some of the struggles we have with marriage today. But then you have cultures like in Australia with these very structured patrilineal or matrilineal clans.
And one thing that's clear is that there was incredible diversity. Back then, before agriculture, we're talking maybe 5 to 8 million foragers spread across the globe, probably thousands of distinct tribes, each with its own language, its own culture, all thanks to that cognitive revolution and the ability to imagine different realities.
And even though they might have traded occasionally, mostly for luxury items, these bands were largely independent. They weren't reliant on each other for food or resources. So their interactions, both social and political, were probably pretty infrequent. And the idea of a fixed permanent tribe, like we imagine it, probably didn't really exist.
And the total human population at this point was tiny, smaller than modern-day Cairo. Can you imagine? The entire human species, fewer people than in one city today.
It is mind-boggling. And, there's even evidence of early pet ownership. Like there's a 12,000-year-old grave in Israel where a woman was buried with a puppy. Shows you that even then, they had these complex emotional bonds with animals.
So they were nomadic, moving around within a certain territory, following the seasons, the animal migrations. Their diet was really diverse, too, mostly gathering plants, fungi, that kind of thing. But they also hunted and scavenged, and what's amazing is how much they knew about their environment.
It's true. They had these incredible mental maps of their territories. They knew everything about the plants and animals, their behavior when they migrated. They were skilled tool makers. They knew how to survive. Some sources even suggest that average brain size might have actually decreased since the foraging era because of specialization.
Right.
Like, you don't need such a big brain if you're only doing a few specific tasks. It's the idea of niches for imbeciles.
And physically, they were in incredible shape. Like their fitness, their dexterity, it's hard to even fathom today.
But it's important to remember, We can't romanticize them too much. They were complex. They had their problems, their conflicts.
Right, like the archaeological evidence shows that violence wasn't uncommon. Like there are sites in the Danube Valley with really high rates of violent death, and then there are places like Jebel Sahaba and Offnet Cave where they found evidence of massacres.
And there's a lot we just don't know. All the wars they might have fought, their religions, their philosophies, their art, even influential individuals, all lost to time.
And even though they didn't have ships or advanced technology, they were already having a big impact on the environment. Like, they probably played a major role in wiping out the megafauna in Australia when they arrived, and then later, the giant birds in New Zealand.
They were a force to be reckoned with, even then.
Okay, so now we get to a big turning point, the agricultural revolution. About 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BC, seems like an obvious step forward, right? You go from hunting and gathering to farming, settle down, build villages.
Yeah, but your sources, they present a really interesting, almost counterintuitive take on this.
To put it mildly, their argument is that, well, it wasn't just humans domesticating plants, it was plants domesticating humans.
Yep.
Like, take wheat. 10,000 years ago, it was just a wild grass growing in a small area. Now it's everywhere. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's been wildly successful.
And the thing is, this shift to agriculture, it wasn't necessarily a good deal for everyone, especially at first. You had problems like malnutrition because people were relying on just a few crops.
Right, so it wasn't this paradise we often imagine.
Not at all.
For a child dying of hunger because the crops failed, it must have felt anything but progress.
So why didn't they just go back to foraging? Well, for one, it happened gradually, over generations. By the time the full effects were felt, no one remembered the old ways. And also, there's the population boom. Once you have all these people relying on agriculture, you can't easily go back. There wouldn't be enough food.
It's almost like a trap.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, those pre-agricultural societies, they might have been more sophisticated than we realize. Like, look at Göbekli Tepe, this massive complex built by hunter-gatherers. They were capable of incredible cooperation.
And then there's animal domestication, like sheep. They were selectively bred over time to be more docile, to produce more wool.
Which had benefits, obviously. Food, raw materials, muscle power. It led to whole new ways of life, like pastoralism.
But it was also pretty brutal. Imagine being a wild animal and suddenly you're being confined, forced to breed, castrated. Your instincts are completely thwarted.
It raises some really uncomfortable questions about the ethics of it all.
For sure. And this new lifestyle, it brought new anxieties too. You were now dependent on these crops, these animals, a drought, a disease, and you were in trouble.
And the need to store surplus food, it led to new forms of social organization, political systems warfare, art, even philosophy, all ultimately supporting a small elite who controlled those resources.
And that's how we get to social hierarchies. Like Hammurabi's code, it's very clear. Some lives are worth more than others, depending on your status, your gender. And these hierarchies, they were often presented as natural, divinely ordained.
Right, like the divine right of kings. But if you compare this to, say, the American Declaration of Independence, it shows that even these ideas of equality, inequality, they're imagined orders. We believe in them not because they're objectively true, but because they allow us to function as societies.
And these imagined orders, they need to be believed, especially by the people in power. If enough people start to question them, the whole system could collapse.
It's almost like Voltaire said, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how these imagined orders shape even our desires. Like the whole idea of going on vacation to a faraway place, that's not a basic human need. It's a product of modern consumerism.
So we're not just shaped by biology, but by these cultural narratives.
Now, as societies got bigger, more complex, they needed a way to manage all this information. That's where writing comes in. Invented by the Sumerians around 3,500 to 3,000 BC. And it started as a way to store data. Grain inventories, taxes, financial transactions.
And the first recorded name in history, Kushim, he was an accountant. It tells you something about their priorities.
Numbers.
Numbers. Writing wasn't for poetry or philosophy at first. It was for record keeping. And even as full scripts developed later on, these partial scripts, number systems, they remain crucial for running states, empires. It's almost like a precursor to, artificial intelligence and binary code.
Okay, so we've got agriculture, we've got cities, we've got writing, and these social hierarchies, they become more and more rigid, often justified by stories about like how it's natural or even divinely ordained. Like in the Hindu caste system, different castes were believed to be created from different parts of the god Brahma, or in ancient China, they thought different social classes came from different types of soil.
But what your sources really emphasize is that these hierarchies, they're not based on actual biological differences. There's no genetic basis for saying a Brahmin is superior to a Shudra, or that slaves are inherently inferior to free people. We might have superficial differences, but those don't justify discrimination or oppression.
And these ideas of purity and pollution, they were often used to reinforce those divisions. Like, if you believe a certain group is inherently unclean, it's easier to justify treating them badly.
Right. And the rise of racial hierarchies is a perfect example of how historical accidents can lead to these deeply ingrained prejudices. The need for cheap labor in the Americas, combined with the fact that Africans were often better suited to the climate, led to the transatlantic slave trade, a completely artificial hierarchy based on skin color.
And then to justify it, they came up with all these myths, like the curse of Ham, or the idea that certain races are biologically inferior. It's a vicious cycle. Discrimination leads to social stigma, which then leads to laws like the Jim Crow laws, which then reinforces the prejudice.
And the idea of women as property, that's another example. In many societies, rape wasn't a crime against the woman, but against the man who owned her. Even in religious texts, you see things like women being forced to marry their rapists.
It really makes you question the whole idea of natural roles for men and women. Like, why were almost all the leaders in empires men? If women are supposedly better at manipulating people, at keeping the peace, why weren't they in charge?
Right, like the patriarchal genes theory tries to explain this by saying men evolved to be more competitive, more dominant, but then you look at animals like elephants or bonobos where the females are in charge, so it's not that simple.
The sources argue that it's culture, not just genes, that shapes these roles. And culture is constantly changing. Like in medieval Europe, you had this tension between Christian humility and the chivalric code. Or today, we struggle with balancing individual liberty and social equality. It's these contradictions that drive cultural evolution.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about how the world became more interconnected. Back in 10,000 BC, you had thousands of separate human worlds. But by 1450 AD, Afro-Eurasia was basically one big mega-world.
And one big factor in that was money. Barter systems, they just don't work when societies get too big. Money, whether it's barley, cowrie shells, or gold coins, it's essentially a shared fiction. It represents value.
And the key to money is trust. You accept a certain currency because you believe others will accept it too. And that trust is often backed up by institutions, kings, priests. So you can see how money, politics, and ideology, they're all linked. And the shift from commodity money, like barley, which has its own inherent value, to fiat money, like those Lydian coins, which are just valuable because we agree they are, that was a big step.
Money allows for cooperation on a massive scale, but the sources also point out that it can be corrosive. It can erode local traditions, replace them with a more impersonal logic of the market.
Another big unifying force was empires. And empires weren't always about conquest. They were often quite diverse, with flexible borders. And they've been surprisingly common throughout history. For the last 2,500 years, they've been the dominant form of political organization.
We tend to think of empires as bad, but it's more complicated than that. Most modern cultures are built on the legacies of empires. And trying to completely reject that, well, it might just end up legitimizing older empires that were even worse.
Exactly. And there was a shift over time in how empires justified themselves. Early empires, like the Akkadian or Assyrian empires, they were mostly about glorifying the ruler. But later empires, like the Persian Empire under Cyrus, they claimed to be spreading a superior culture, bringing benefits to the conquered people.
So another major unifying force was religion. It's a system of shared beliefs and values based on a superhuman order. And that order, it's not something humans invented, it's something we have to follow.
Right, that's what sets it apart from, say, the rules of a football game.
And religions, they evolved over time, from animism, where everything has a spirit, to polytheism with multiple gods. And polytheism wasn't just primitive superstition. Many polytheistic systems recognized a single underlying force, like fate in Greek and Norse mythology, or Atman in Hinduism.
But then you have the rise of monotheism, which is really remarkable. Starting as a small sect, it became the dominant faith in much of the world by the 16th century. And even monotheism, it often absorbed elements of older beliefs, like the devil or Satan. It shows you how humans can hold contradictory ideas at the same time.
And Buddhism, it offered a different kind of universal religion, focused on ending suffering. But even Buddhists, they often ended up worshiping local gods alongside Buddha.
Then you have the humanist religions like liberal humanism, socialism. Even the Nazis had their own twisted version, evolutionary humanism, which they used to justify genocide. It shows that not all unifying ideas are good.
And that brings us to the scientific revolution. The world in 1500 was a completely different place. Smaller populations, limited technology, very little knowledge about the world. The scientific revolution changed everything.
And modern science, it's different from anything that came before. For one, it's willing to admit ignorance, to say we don't know. It's also based on observation, experiments, and math. And most importantly, it accepts that even our best theories can be proven wrong.
It's a very different mindset from the old traditions, where they believed all the important knowledge was already known.
And the scientific method, combining observation with math, that's what really fueled this revolution. The goal became to find mathematical formulas that could explain how nature works, like Newton's laws of motion.
And math started to be used even in fields you wouldn't expect. Like in the 18th century, they were using it to calculate life insurance premiums in Scotland. Or today, you have things like mathematical linguistics or psychology.
And the combination of science, industry, military technology, all within this capitalist system, it led to the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And the pace of change just accelerated.
And there was this shift in how people thought about the future. Instead of looking back to a golden age, they started to believe in progress, that the future could be better than the past.
And there were some amazing advances like in medicine, anesthetics, antiseptics. They drastically reduced suffering. It's a far cry from the brutal medical practices of the past. But the sources also make a really important point. Science itself doesn't tell us what to do. It can be used for good or bad.
Like, the funding for research is often driven by economic or political interests. They might put more money into studying a disease that affects cows' udders because it impacts milk production than into understanding the minds of cows. And with genetic engineering, the same technology can be used to cure diseases or to create designer babies.
And then there's the link between science and empire. Scientific advances helped empires expand, like how Cook's voyages relied on scientific observations and the cure for scurvy, and empires provided resources for scientific research.
It's hard to separate the two. Like, was Cook's expedition a scientific mission or a military one? It was both.
And the question of why Europe became the dominant global power, that's interesting too. It wasn't that they were necessarily more advanced at first. The Chinese had amazing ships, like those of Zheng He, but Europe had this unique ambition to explore, to conquer. And that was driven by the scientific mindset of admitting ignorance, of wanting to know more. Those blank spaces on the map, they were a challenge.
And the European conquest of the Americas, it happened so fast, so brutally. It's in stark contrast to other empires like the Aztecs, the Incas, the Ottomans, even the Chinese. They weren't as focused on expansion.
So you can see this kind of symbiotic relationship between science and imperialism.
Okay, now let's dive into capitalism. The economic growth we've seen in the modern era is completely unprecedented. Before 1500, per capita production was basically stagnant for centuries. Then, boom.
Right, and it all comes down to this magic circle. The belief in future growth leads to credit, which fuels new ventures, discoveries, colonies, profits. And those profits reinforce the belief in growth, leading to more credit, and so on. It's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Like Columbus, he needed credit to finance his voyages. And if he succeeded, the potential profits were enormous. But it was a huge gamble.
And the difference between a king and a capitalist is risk. A king, like the Spanish king who funded Columbus, he had a lot to lose if the voyage failed. But a group of merchants, like the Dutch merchants who funded later expeditions, they could spread the risk, so they were more willing to take chances.
And then you have these powerful corporations like the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. They were ruthlessly pursuing their own interests, colonizing, exploiting, and they were incredibly successful.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. The Atlantic slave trade, the Bengal famine, the brutal practices of the VOC in Indonesia, capitalism has a dark side.
And then there's the Industrial Revolution. It was a revolution in how we use energy. We went from relying on wood, wind, water, to harnessing the power of coal, oil, eventually even nuclear energy.
And the invention of the steam engine, that was a game changer. It took a while to figure out how to convert heat into motion efficiently, but once they did, it opened up a whole new world of possibilities.
And the pace of technological innovation just kept accelerating.
But this new technology, it also had consequences for animals. Think about factory farms. We can provide for their basic needs, but their lives are miserable. They're crammed together, unable to express their natural behaviors. Evolutionary psychology tells us that their instincts, their needs, they're still there, even if they're no longer necessary for survival in this artificial environment.
And then there's consumerism, this whole new ethic where you have to keep buying things even if you don't need them. Frugality became a bad word.
Like, remember that quote from the cereal box? I go, you can never have too much cereal.
Yeah, it's all about generating demand, keeping the wheels of industry turning.
And industrialization, capitalism, they also led to the standardization of time. Time zones, clocks, everything became synchronized.
And traditional family and community structures, they started to break down. People became more individualistic. The state and the market took over some of the roles that families and communities used to play.
It led to the rise of imagined communities, like the nation. You feel a sense of belonging with millions of people you've never met just because you share a passport.
It's amazing how much has changed in just a couple of centuries, and it's still changing.
For sure. And despite all the violence and upheaval, the world today is actually more peaceful than it's ever been, at least in terms of wars between nations.
Now, here's a really interesting question. Were people happier in the past? Like, were the people of ancient Uruk happier than foragers? It's a question we rarely ask, but it's important.
Right. And it's tempting to think that more stuff automatically equals more happiness. But that's not always true. Like the agricultural revolution, it brought us more food, but it also brought new problems, new anxieties.
And there are these subjective well-being questionnaires they use to try to measure happiness. And they find that things like wealth, democracy, marriage, they do correlate with happiness to some extent.
But there's also the hedonic treadmill. We adapt to changes in our circumstances. So even if something good happens, we eventually go back to our baseline level of happiness.
And from a biological perspective, happiness is basically about brain chemistry. So a medieval peasant and a modern banker, they might have very similar levels of serotonin in their brains.
But there are other ways to think about happiness. Like Daniel Kahneman found that raising kids, even though it's often stressful and annoying, it's something people look back on with fondness. So there's a difference between how we experience things in the moment and the meaning we ascribe to them later on.
And then there's the Buddhist view, where true happiness comes from understanding reality and letting go of attachments.
Now, looking to the future, we have things like genetic engineering. The creation of ALBA, the glow-in-the-dark rabbit, it shows how we're moving towards a world where life is designed, not just evolved.
So if we can bring back Neanderthals, why not design a better Sapiens?
Right. We could potentially alter our genes to live longer, be smarter, feel different emotions. It could be a second cognitive revolution.
But of course, there are ethical concerns. Should we be playing God?
On the other hand, we have this deep-seated desire to cure diseases, to extend life, the Gilgamesh Project.
Yeah.
And that drive, it might lead us down a path we can't fully foresee.
We're already blurring the lines between biology and technology. Like, there are people with bionic limbs that they can control with their thoughts.
And there are projects trying to create artificial human brains in computers. It raises some really fundamental questions about what it means to be human.
And the sources end on a thought-provoking note. If we do create these new forms of life, these future gods, they'll be shaped by our own values, so we need to be careful about what we create.
So there you have it, the entire sweep of human history, from the Big Bang to the potential for a future beyond biology.
It's a story of constant change, unexpected consequences, and the power of ideas.
And for you, the listener, as you think about all this, what do you think will change the most about being human in the coming decades? It's something worth pondering.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time.